Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Back at the beginning of June, I released a video entitled The Battle of the Low End as part of the GPU June event. In this video, I showed off two laptops from around 2005, and both of which having integrated instead of discrete graphics, and showed how well, or poorly, that they could perform in games and benchmarks from around that time. This was the first YouTube video I've ever released for public consumption, and it seems to have actually been pretty well received. Also, as a side note, because of that video, the GPU June playlist has a poop emoji in its thumbnail. And I'd like to think of that as two victories instead of one. That aside, I think it's about time for round two. Welcome back to the Battle of the Low End. Today, we're going back to the ancient times of the year 2008. Normally, when you're looking at retro computing content on YouTube, you find discussion of the high-end components of yesteryear, the stuff that mere mortals could only dream about owning at the time it was new. It's understandable that the focus would be on this hardware, of course, as it's the hardware that everyone wanted at the time. But it's not the hardware most of us actually had. For example, for every one Barnstormer PC you may have seen with a GeForce 8800 GTX, you would see dozens of family machines that were lucky if they had an 8400 GS. And that's ignoring all those people with only a laptop instead. So, why don't we explore that? Let's pull up those drags and see what we find there. So, welcome to the Battle of the Low End. So, in the first video, I magicked the laptops into view. And I have no idea if I can use this YouTube magic when I'm in the camera frame as well. Let's give it a shot, I guess. And... this is not from 2008. This is not even close from 2008. Also, it weighs as much as the f***ing sun. Okay, yes, this is from around 2008, but I already gave you your own video. Go away. Okay, fine. We'll talk about a ThinkPad. This is a ThinkPad T61, one of the few ThinkPads that actually deserves its reputation for toughness. As you may expect, this is a rather low-end one, but low-end in 2008 still gets you a whole lot more than in 2005, like we saw in the first episode. In particular, this T61 comes equipped with a Core 2 Duo T8300, a dual-core Penryn chip running at 2.4 GHz. It is paired with the Intel GM965 chipset, which for those of you sane enough to not have the Wikipedia page for List of Intel chipsets on speed dial, gives us GMA X3100 graphics. To round things off here, we have 2.5 GB of DDR2 memory, and that GMA solution is driving a 1280 by 800 display. Let's just stick with the table shot for the next laptop. It's easier to use the YouTube magic that way. Ooh, another business book. Perfect! This is a Dell Latitude D531, a budget-oriented counterpart to the D630. True to its budget title, we find more budget specs, starting with an AMD Turion X2 TL56. This is a Tyler family chip running at only 1.8 GHz. As for the chipset, we find the AMD M690T, which again brings us our GPU, Radeon Xpress X1250. Rounding things off on this one, we also have 2.5 GB of DDR2 memory and a 1280 by 800 screen. Alright, we've got our GPU matchup for episode 2. GMA X3100 versus Radeon Xpress X1250. That's a lot of X's. Let's talk a bit about each of these designs real quick, starting with our Team Blue competitor. It's gotten quite the upgrade from its relative in the first episode. GMA X3100 released with the mobile 960 and 965 family chipsets in May 2007. We're now looking at Intel's Gen 4 design, which brings us into the era of unified shaders. The X3100 has 8 of these unified shaders, or execution units in Intel parlance, running at 500 MHz on this system. With this leap forward, we also find much better API support. This core now supports DirectX 10 with full Shader Model 4 support, and either OpenGL 1.5 or 2.1, depending on your OS of choice. Now, if Intel could bring us this much of a leap forward in the last couple years, surely ATI could do way better, right? Let's look at the Radeon Xpress X1250. With the RS690 chipset, it was released in February 2007. This design is based on ATI's X700 design using the R400 architecture, which of course is not unified shader? Uh-oh. Anyway, R400 in a 4244 configuration, with the core clocked at 400 MHz. As for API support, we're looking at DirectX 9.0 as well as OpenGL 2.0. I'll be kinda blunt here, this already is not looking good for Team Red. But as we know, specs on paper, or your computer screen, don't matter much. Let's start talking about how we'll be testing them. For easy comparison to previously tested hardware, we'll start off with the same 4 benchmarks I've used before: 3D Mark 2001, 3D Mark 2005, Half-Life 2, and Unreal Tournament 2004. But all 4 of these were admittedly pretty old by the time these machines were made. So let's add one more game to the mix. Some of you may already be thinking it, and yes, we're doing it. Let's ask the question.
Maximum speed.
Can it run Crysis? Let's find out. Starting off as always with 3D Mark 2001, we find results that are at first glance both familiar and unexpected. We see, just like with the GMA 500 video, massive improvements in texture fill rate compared to each design's predecessor, except when it comes to single texture fill rate and the GMA designs, where we actually see a pretty large regression. What is even more surprising is that this is a pattern that continues into both game demo tests. While the ATI design either improves or at least matches the previous generation design, the GMA X3100 loses to GMA 900 in both cases. In the end, this may not actually be so surprising. Let's step back from the benchmark for a second to explain why. The X3100 was a brand new architecture at the time, and we're trying to test it on what was, at the time, a 6 or 7 year old benchmark. Hardware and games evolved a ton in this time period, and you can't really blame Intel for not emphasizing legacy performance. The X1250 does not see this sort of performance loss, as it kind of was actually a legacy design of sorts. The R400 architecture really did not change that much from R300, which is the architecture previously used in the Express 200M, and one that originates from the year 2002. In a sense, we're basically seeing a 200M with double the pixel shaders and texture mapping units, and a 33% clock increase. From that perspective, the performance here makes sense. Now we can move on to the next benchmark. 3D Mark 2005 is basically a perfect case in point for my previous explanation. Now that we've moved into a more contemporary era of game design, we can see both designs, to put it mildly, running away with it. Over 2 times the performance in Return to Proxicon and Firefly Forest, double to triple in Vertex shaders, and in the case of the GMAs in the pixel shader test, nearly a 6 times improvement. I'm not sure if this says more about how good GMA X3100 may be, or just how awful GMA 900 was. But either way, we can see that the X3100 edges ahead of the X1250 in almost every test. Let's see if this pattern holds up when we move on to an actual game benchmark. Half-Life 2 shows that the 3D Mark 05 result was more indicative of contemporary games than the 01 result. It also shows that this is a very close matchup. We get FPS numbers that are statistically identical in the point insertion and Nova Prospect tests, though the X1250 falls behind somewhat in water hazard. Either way, we're getting results that are very playable throughout the whole game, which is more than the 2005 era competitors could say. Let's move on to our final old benchmark. The Unreal Tournament 2004 results are a bit more divided. As you may expect, both designs again are well ahead of their older counterparts, but we see different levels of performance between the two designs as well. All three maps have one design win by a margin that I would say is just large enough to be outside margin of error, but it's not the same design each time. X1250 wins in Anubis, but X3100 wins in Avarice and Desolation. I could give guesses as to why we see this distinction, but they would only be guesses. Again, either design is well into playable territory now, even for a fast-paced arena shooter like UT04. The X1250 even almost touches 60 FPS in Anubis. Alright, I've kept you waiting long enough. It's time for the main event. Let's see if these little integrated graphics underdogs can achieve
Maximum speed.
No, they cannot. Did you really expect otherwise? Even at these low settings, we're playing a slideshow. Though in some of the less complex scenes, we can start to see frame rates that start to somewhat resemble something playable. But more importantly, we actually see a major win for the X1250. It's still unplayable, but it's well ahead of the X3100. This is actually quite a surprise, given the origins of its design, as I explained earlier, but these results don't leave a lot of room to question it. For the cutting edge of the time, an old ATI holdover still can and does beat Intel's latest and greatest. So, what does all this mean? If I had stopped at the legacy benchmarks, the X3100 would be the pretty clear winner, with small but consistent wins across all four benchmarks. But as we saw, the tables more than turned when it came to Crysis. That leaves us with mixed results, and no objective winner. So, let's be subjective instead. I'm gonna say the winner is Radeon Xpress X1250. Why, you may ask? Honestly, it's just a bit more interesting. GMA X3100 laptops were everywhere. Basically every single budget Intel laptop from the time was equipped with it, while X1250 is a bit more interesting. Intel laptops were always just a bit more common than AMD ones, and although this chipset did also come in an Intel flavor, several months before the AMD one even, that was also uncommon for other reasons. Also, don't forget that the X1250 is a part of retro GPU nobility. It's an ATI R400 design, with other, more beefy relatives such as the X850 XT, or going back to R300, the legendary 9700 Pro. Okay, if you're eagle-eyed, you've probably already noticed this is actually a 9600 XT, and for that matter, this is also an X800 Pro. But I still think that's close enough for a family photo. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you've heard the drill from every other YouTuber on the planet. I also have these two previous videos, both of which I made for the GPU June event. If you have other ideas for old low-end hardware you want to see covered, leave it in the comments, and we'll see what I can do. See you next time.